Velocity is a space trading game which I've reviewed elsewhere, in addition to showing available editors. My previous project that I publicized on YouTube was an attempt at porting old Escape Velocity plugins, add-on ships, add-on missions, add-on star systems, and so on. And I already had all of the sprites and everything. I just had to figure out a way of porting them over from Mac OS Classic to Windows, in my case. And the nice thing about that was, if you're using the Escape Velocity Nova engine, which I was, all you really need to do is replace the data files with that data. And then it will not only be useful in Windows, but also in Mac OS X. So it's actually a pretty nice opportunity for reviving an old game, because I always preferred Escape Velocity Classic over the other two in the series. Now, for many years, I've been wanting to build a completely original ship. The first ship that I built was actually a Confederate battleship, which I was able to create the sprite for by doubling the size of the cruiser sprite. So it wasn't really all that revolutionary a thing to do. The original models that were used, because it's important to understand that it was a fake 3D game. It had two-dimensional sprites which had been made from actual 3D models. So it looked 3D even though it wasn't. The way they did that was they built the models in Bryce 3D, added lighting in different positions to create the correct images to turn into a sprite, essentially. They would render at each angle, and there were a lot of choices as to how many degrees they could turn. And so I figured this out many, many years ago, that I could do this in Blender. And while playing Escape Velocity for the first time in many, many years recently, it occurred to me that there aren't really very good escort ships in Escape Velocity. And this is important because you only have just so much capacity in your own ship. So if you want to be a successful trader, you need escort ships to carry the commodities that you're trading. And the best one I've found is the bulk freighter, which in the original Escape Velocity wasn't even rentable as an escort or buyable as your own ship. So I modded that so that you could use it, as many other people also did. And the real reason it's so useful is not actually its cargo capacity, which is the largest of any of the original Escape Velocity ships. That is a factor. But it also has a very, very low initial cost, so 120,000 credits. What does that mean? Well, the way the pricing of the ships works in Escape Velocity is that you have your initial ship cost. Then a commission for hiring an escort is a tenth the initial cost of buying the ship for yourself. Then you have rental fees, which you have to pay periodic, and those are a tenth of that. Now that sounds very affordable. The problem is the profit you can make by trading even the most valuable commodities is much too small for most of these ships' rental costs. So you might be able to afford to fly it yourself, you might be able to afford to hire it as an escort just fine, but very few of these ships will give you a good margin if you're having to pay the rental on them. The bulk freighter is an exception. So why not use the bulk freighter? Well, the primary problem with using a bulk freighter is that some of the best trade routes in Escape Velocity are through space, which is, controlled by pirates or the rebels, or which are disputed. So you end up in a situation where your escorts get blown up, you lose all the commodities on those ships, and then you also have to rehire them. And so it would make sense to have beefier, as they put it, freighters in your escort fleet. So what would you do? Well, the Argosy, of course, is designed to be an armed freighter. That's very useful for that, except it's too expensive. You would end up spending, depending on where you're buying it, because they do vary the prices, like around 600,000, 700,000 crowns. And then you have to pay the hiring commission. Again, it wouldn't be so bad. It'd be 70,000, 60,000 in that ballpark. But then your rental fees would be 6,000 or 7,000, which is actually more than your profit a lot of the time. especially when you consider that the Argosy can't carry very much. The Star Rider, if you have the Star Rider plugin, which of course I've ported, it's one of the ships I've ported, I like it as a personal ship, but the problem is it's not got enough cargo capacity. And it also is much too expensive. The initial cost is 1.6 million credits. So, knock that down to a tenth, 160,000 to hire. Again, manageable. But then once you get into the rental fees, it's 16,000, which is not manageable. So I was thinking, well, what would be a solution to this in a add-on ship? So I experimented with a few different mods of existing ships, and then I decided to build my own. So I don't know really why I named my own ship the Alpaca, but it's basically similar in specifications to the medium freighter, which again is one of the add-on ships that you can get, but which is too expensive. It's a very similar price range to the Argosy. It has more cargo capacity, so there are things to recommend it, but the problem is that it's simply not particularly affordable. I mean, it has more cargo capacity, but it doesn't make up for the high cost. So I figured I could make something closer in cost to the AS-129 light freighter, but with more protection on it. A little bit more expensive, but not as expensive as an Argosy. Yet, at the same time, larger cargo capacity than Argosy. So I thought, well, what would a ship like that look like? It'll be ugly, probably. In theory, it would be something really cheap, like something very low tech. So I made it big, big and tough, but not particularly sophisticated in any way. It wasn't very fast. It didn't have a lot of weapons on it. It's just not that fancy. And it has a small crew. That's, I guess, realistic, like in the real situation. Say, a few hundred years in the future, if they don't use drones, they're going to have very small crews. So I gave it a crew of 3. And in escape velocity, that makes it worth it to buy something fancier for yourself, because if you try to board, some pirate ship that you want to capture or plunder or whatever, you're going to need more crew, because that's a large part of the distinction between different ships in terms of crew and escape velocity, is that the larger your crew, the easier it is to capture an enemy ship. So the Alpaca is supposed to be the cheapest tough cargo ship you can buy, and the best one for trading in space, which is dominated by pirates and so on. And you might say, well, why make a huge YouTube video about this? I have not even decided if I'm going to release this to the general public yet, because it is kind of crude. So what I decided to do was to make this a video about how to build a modern add-on escape velocity ship. Now, this methodology would require a little bit more fiddling if you're going to use the ship with escape velocity Nova. I am considering building an escape velocity Nova version of it and putting that in another video. But the main challenge, if you've pulled these games apart, is that escape velocity just uses a sprite that's shot directly overhead of the 3D model. So that's pretty easy to do, as long as you understand lighting, which I'm going to show. However, escape velocity Nova is at an angle, and you also have to model the maneuvering thrusters and everything else as they glow. Escape velocity Nova looks very nice, but obviously whenever you build a game that looks nicer, it's more difficult to develop content for it. I mean, this would be true of any game, actually. So what I'm going to do here is I'm going to show you the Alpaca, which is already complete, and give you a very brief summary of how I built it.